stage 2040 to 2340. We'd like to begin by asking, how can architectures of tomorrow be a catalyst to initiate new vibrant ecosystems? How does architecture become a mechanism to introduce and create symbiotic relationships? We began to investigate these questions through the perspective of Maya. The year is 2040. Maya 1 is 8 years old. Life expectancy has declined due to increased pandemics. Humans look to develop traits found in archaea, an ancient microorganism that thrives in extreme environments. The climate has grown erratic and unpredictable. There's a shift in culture from an isolated lifestyle to a mobile one. It is 2140. Maya 2 is in a mobile dwelling traveling in a heat wave. Maya 2 is in a biocluster tasked to harvest crops from a once human populated city. The gatherers of the cluster will travel into the city where non-human species roam to collect food and plant seeds for the next biocluster to harvest. It is 2240. Maya 3 is living in a community of bioclusters. Maya 3 now makes voyages onto the cities to gather food. Air quality has improved due to the use of solar and wind energy and transportation using magnetic levitation. As the gatherers collect food, they will be scanned for bacteria and pathogens. It is 2340. Maya 4 attends in-person classes to educate archihumans on sedentary living. Bioclusters and branches have been settling in cities for longer periods of time. Climate has become less erratic and air is purified almost entirely. Viruses and pathogens have been eradicated. The drawing exploration depicts a mapping of the future of the world that will surround Maya. As time will progress, developments of technology overlap various species extinctions. Environmental changes will drastically alter the living environment. Deserts expand, oceans rise, and populations, both human and non-human, migrate across the globe in search of new spaces to inhabit. With climate change at its peak, the relationship between humans and the environment is complex and delicate. Throughout the centuries of modern civilization, humans have built over natural ecologies, footprints have been erased, non-human habitats have been destroyed, and biodiversity has been diminished. As a consequence, superstorms, rising sea levels, and pandemics will continue to affect the lives, daily routines, and interactions between humans. If climate change is irreversible, civilization must prepare for the extremities of the environment with non-human species as an equal priority to the human. Research and diagrams from the Nature Conservancy depict non-human migration by mammals, birds, and amphibians. As the climate changes more rapidly and the environment becomes more extreme, various species are in danger of extinction because they're not able to adapt and migrate fast enough. Initially, we looked at various precedents that prioritize the relationships between humans and non-humans, Earth as a singular vessel, seed protection, and the development of architecture through the machine as precedents for our design. We studied the story of Noah's Ark, and while our project collects species to protect them from extinction, we refer to it as an anti-ark because it does not neglect the suffering environment. Instead, it's using the necessity of travel as a means to regenerate and heal the lands affected by human intervention. The impacts of humans to establish railways using large machinery to build over natural landscapes was extremely destructive. Driven by colonialization, labor was exploited to plow lands, excavate mountains, and flatten over soil rich in biodiversity. This contributed to the disjointed relationship between humans and non-humans. These paths, however, are essential to rectify the damage that humans have done. When these connections are developed responsibly, all species can be unified and preserved throughout the landmass. Existing railways and interstates connect all locations and climates across the US and provide the opportunity to be repurposed. To avoid frequent life-altering disasters or deadly disease, humans will be in constant migration and return to a nomadic state. Maya's voyage will use this motion to restore the land and into the once non-human ecologies. As new extreme conditions are detected, infrastructure paths will be traveled to collect humans and non-humans in danger and aid their migration to safer places. Although the mass acts as a means for relocation, there's a strong focus on the voyage and connections within the mass, with less emphasis on the destination, acting as a protector and an open home to species in need. As the masses travel across the United States, they will collect and store seeds of various plants and crops. Passengers will learn how to revive their suffering ecosystems. They will reference hardiness maps that indicate which seeds would best thrive in their current location and carefully mix them to be dispersed as they travel along their route. We propose to reorient technological developments and educate humans on how to assist nature and to initiate natural diversity, utilizing these new conditions as an opportunity to rebuild. We imagine the cities of the future returning to the natural ecologies that encourage the non-humans to thrive. As mobile architecture travels along the repurposed infrastructures, the seeds collected will be scattered onto the grounds consistently along its route and initiate new growth. Assisted vegetation will grow as the beginning of a greener landscape, and as time passes, it will continue to develop into new strips of greenery ever more abundant. In the local scale, urban spaces will be overgrown with regenerated green space, non-humans will roam and inhabit, while future Maya generations travel to heal the ground space. Mobile architecture can utilize technology to collect endangered beings, regenerate and protect. It can preserve nature internally while encouraging growth and healing externally, spreading seeds to pollinate the dry and desolate grounds that once flourished as a natural biodiverse ecosystem. The planted seeds will begin to provide resources and habitation to the non-human species. As our project continued to develop several connected facets, we produced a logic tree to organize the systems and solutions. While traveling, the mass will collect our current plastics and other waste from across the country to convert into building material. The opportunity to expand the mass is initiated by a collection of waste left in the world outside Maya's voyage. Its thickness will provide the ability to internally protect species, both human and non-human, from vulnerable zones while healing the Earth from its accumulated waste and toxicity. Human occupation will include education, agricultural research, farming, and animal care. It includes space for both temporary and long-term housing. Non-human occupants threatened by current conditions will be collected from dangerous climate zones and have vast space to roam freely in protection. They will be properly nurtured and cared for to prevent their extinction. Natural landscapes will develop and grow to become vibrant ecosystems and diverse vegetation zones for all occupants to inhabit. A large portion of the human zones will be dedicated to education. Those aboard will be educated on the importance of non-human species, including plants and animals. They will learn how to plant collected seeds from across the country in a way that would be most successful. They will learn how to care for the endangered animals aboard and will learn how to live less wasteful lives. Large seed banks will sort and protect the future of plant diversity. Seeds would be harvested and studied, then dispersed along the routes traveled. Studies indicate that magnetic impulse both aids and strengthens the speed, quality, and intensity in which plants can grow. On the larger scale, a magnetic mesh will be weaved and placed onto the ground along existing roots. This will free the ground plane for nature to grow and inhabit, and it will allow the landmass to use magnetic levitation technology to hover over the ground and spread seeds, which will flourish into vegetation and grow more rapidly. Maya's voyage is a series of hybridized landmasses, both natural and industrial. Model studies help to orient our design as a chunk of Earth in which humans and plant species are in symbiosis. Initial explorations of materiality and spatial variation revealed new relationships between the constructed and the natural world. We studied how porousness could influence program, light, and building systems. Thick yet porous walls made from collected and accumulated waste shape in an interior space that is constantly growing and developing. In the proposed landmass, the vegetation growth zones will encourage plants to flourish, allow seeds to reproduce, and provide food for humans and non-humans, and circulate fresh air through the spaces. Over time, the vegetation will grow up and along the walls surrounding the constructed interior spaces to provide growing and maturing environments. Humans can dwell, research, and learn. Natural zones surrounding human centers provide access and cohabitation with natural ecosystems. This juxtaposition encourages humans to engage with a variety of plant and non-human species to create new symbiotic relationships. Internal mechanical infrastructure connects to spaces and disperses essentials. Plants will be harvested, stored, reproduced, and planted. Large openings in the roof allow light into the interior zones. Water retention pods collect rain to be filtered and reused internally. Expanses of trees provide shade to those who roam the roofscape. Variations of the space encourage different occupancies and engagement for numerous programs. Variation of topographical conditions will become a stable environment for species previously threatened by natural disasters. Internal building systems allow the circulation of water, air, nutrients. Plant seeds will be actively studied, generated, and evolved. Seed banks provide the protection for both newly evolved and aged species. While traveling, the systems will release seeds from the vault and disperse along the transportation routes. Research laboratories, social spaces, and vegetation zones are connected by light wells that provide sun exposure necessary for the preservation and continuity of life. Maya, the occupant, whether on board for a pursuit of environmental and animal education, an interest in continued research, or taking shelter from extreme conditions, can create new symbiotic relationships with others already settled. As they join, they accept their responsibility to become a healer who can learn to actively engage their surroundings. Maya's voyage is a collection of landmasses. They may cross paths and intersect, exchange seeds and produce for humans and non-humans. Maya's voyage drifts along the Earth, repelling off the magnetic wet mesh weaved underground, dropping seeds along its route. Non-humans roam freely. Maya learns to give to and build towards Earth's environment, healing throughout their voyage for species to live better tomorrows. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I think we can open it up to conversation. Yeah.
Maybe I can start, just jump in. First, congratulations, fascinating project, very ambitious. Definitely addresses very pressing and critical issues. So I'm admiring all of that. I'm admiring also you, in your presentation, you touched on issues of labor, issues of colonization. Again, with the relation between that and the environmental crisis, and imagining, you know, a different kind of living where the human becomes just one species among many. And of course, you are familiar with the term Anthropocene and the likes. So all these are really fascinating. So I have maybe a couple of questions or a couple of things to think about loud with you. And that has to do when you refer to the word returning to a pre-human existence. And I just have a little bit of maybe cautionary remark, if I may share that. On the one hand, yes, it's definitely very crucial, very important to emphasize and articulate the human role in the destruction of the environment. That's no doubt about that. And definitely, you know, usually the right wing, politically speaking, their idea is like, the environment has always been through crisis, so the human factor is minimized. So definitely I applaud, the emphasis on that. But on the same time, I think an idea of a return to an idealized past or a homogeneous pre-existing, I would say that might be a little problematic in two fronts, I think. One is that it's actually a very humanistic idea projected back onto nature. Because before the existence of a human, concept of destruction, concept of crisis, concept of harmony would not mean anything, because it's a crisis or a destruction from whose point of view? So if we imagine the worst case scenario, if the species vanish and are extinct, including the humans, the planet Earth itself, from a geological point of view, will still exist. It will just be another phase of geological existence. So I'm just, raising that as a question, just to slightly, it's not a critique, honestly, it's just, because your project, because of its richness, it raises these kind of questions. It's just, I'm raising that as maybe just be caution a little bit about, possibly, I'm not saying you're doing that, romanticizing a pre-human existence. And just maybe to question that a little bit. The second comment, again, and this is a very open question, I would have liked to see more political dimension within the project itself. Like when you mention colonization and labor, I think these are very important factors. And somehow, towards the end of your presentation and towards when we look at the project, I'm not able to identify where are these moments where maybe a possible way of addressing the climate crisis will not be just about the climate itself as a natural condition, but the way to address that will be through going through the political dimension. Like who is constructing this project? What is the dynamics of the production even that takes place within this environment? Who's producing what? How is the outcome is distributed? And all these questions, I think, are very important questions, and they have their own impact on the climate. So that's all. But thank you again. Wonderful projects. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for your comments. Yeah.
I had a similar thought there, picking up on what Ashraf was saying about the political. It's funny. Excuse me. I like the project very much. I think the ambition and the kind of scope is awesome. It's fantastic. It's like
Thank you.
this is the form for this kind of let's say speculation, but with a set of almost rules to go by. Like you're creating both you're designing both the world and the rules that world operates by simultaneously. And I think that's what makes it architectural. And that's what makes it a really kind of like juicy subject to be talking about with this kind of sort of architectural series of brains that we have assembled today. So it's really fantastic, and I'm excited to be a part of that. With that said, the first thing I was looking at, there are kind of two things. It's like we create these worlds, or we imagine these worlds, but you almost have to take them super seriously and question everything, right? The politics, the economics, the energy sources. And I know you've touched on some of that with the magnetic levitation, which is the biggest kind of, suspension of disbelief that we can, I'm sure, all muster for this project. Like, okay, this thing floats and that's cool. But there are two things that sort of like are glitches in that whole system. It's like when you're watching a movie and something's not quite right, you realize, oh, it's a movie that I'm watching. I'm not yet immersed fully in the world. And the two things for me in your presentation were the fact that there's still like the state of Wyoming on your map and the state of New Jersey. And there are all these like political borders that you somehow couldn't question or reimagine quite yet. And I wonder if like, does a system of states and or the United States as a kind of sovereign kind of entity, do those borders exist in this new world of mobility and the kind of reimagining of almost all the things that we take for granted now? Like, couldn't one also question the kind of state system or the politics? Like, that's, I think, a big question. And there's also one of the renderings, and this is going to be a little, tongue in cheek, but there was like a white sofa that looked like it could have been designed in the 90s. Like, are we still making couches that look like that? Like, you almost have to reimagine everything that goes into the fabrication of this world. Otherwise, there's a kind of glitch there that I couldn't quite get beyond. So there's that. The other question I had, and it was sort of just a holdover from earlier today as well, like this question of then what? So we've got you've painted this really interesting picture, and what's at stake? What are the repercussions? What is the new type of human? What is the new type of nature? The fact that we're still talking about, I imagine in the future there'll be probably, I mean, let's also say that the word nature, I mean, nature itself is an invention, is a construction, is a very historically kind of contingent sort of concept. Is that concept still viable in 300 years? I think it's as much as it tries to reimagine the kind of post-human world, it still is a very human, as Ashraf said, it's still very humanistic, human-centered storytelling that you took us on. I have to say, I think there's some questions that could be tweaked or things that could be tweaked in the way you present the information that question the very point of view from which the story is being told. It still feels like it's being told from a very humanistic point of view, such that in one of the sections I'm zoomed in on Miro, there's like, it's sort of labeling everything. And then somewhere it said, this area is non-human life. Well, non-human life, that's such a flat term. I mean, what in the world does that mean? Because it's still saying what it's not. It's not human. Well, that's told from a human's point of view. So what is it? What animal species is it? What types of social organizations do leopards have? Do ant colonies have? Do butterflies have? How might that feed back onto kind of human constructs? I mean, really, this sort of meshwork, I think, is what we're all want to see. This kind of unknown, I mean, your job is a hard one. It's to imagine something that, you know, we have no idea what the next 20 years are going to look like. And here you are imagining the next 300. So it's not an easy task. And I think it can get a lot weirder, a lot, you know, a lot more speculative and somewhat messier. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Yeah, just to your point about non-human, I feel like it definitely is a human-centric way to generalize all the species, but I think we were very deliberate not to say like animal zones or animal life, because I feel like animal is also sort of all, because we imagine these spaces to be anywhere from like insects to bacterias to plant species. But yeah, I agree that in 300-400 years, the weirdness of all these concepts could be pushed. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can hop in here. And thank you, James and your team for this project, which I think, as others have mentioned, is really great in the sort of comprehensiveness and the long time scale in which you're, you know, taking really seriously and thinking through, so both the scale of 300 years, but also of a kind of continental scale that you're thinking at. And I also appreciate how you're thinking of an all-encompassing view of the non-human, as you just explained. But building a little bit on Frank and Ashraf's comments, one thing I was thinking about as you kind of took us through this narration, which with Maya, which had this kind of futuristic sci-fi sensibility, I was sort of thinking, okay, if this is a story, if this is like a sci-fi future scenario, where is the kind of conflict or friction within our story? And I think that might kind of help you to, you know, just thinking through that as a construct to tease out some of these questions of the politics that Frank and Ashraf brought up of, you know, we sort of had this seamless, almost omniscient third person narration. And I kept wondering, okay, like who is doing this education? Like who is the actor here? And are there different groups that might come into conflict or have different desires? You know, is there a moment where the non-human elements, you know, whoever those are, kind of push the humans to rethink or to be questioned, like in these symbiotic relationships that you're talking about? You know, because I was thinking about, for instance, the politics of seed banks and the fact that, you know, the control of seeds right now is a very political issue of like Monsanto controlling all the seeds. And I was thinking of this project like the Palestine Heirloom Seed Bank, which is, I'll drop a link to that in the chat later, but a group of Palestinian women who came together to kind of produce their own seed bank so that there could be this kind of frictions and differences within even this process of distributing seeds. And so kind of to that end, I thought maybe there could be moments where the project touched down kind of on the ground a little bit more. I really liked how you were using the infrastructure in place in the US. And I thought that was like a really strong part of the design proposal, was to reimagine and reuse this existing infrastructure, which made me kind of want to have some stories in specific points, like where you show saguaro cactus. I was kind of thinking, okay, maybe this is at, you know, an abandoned depot in Tucson, and we have the saguaro, and we might have a, you know, like a javelina or something, you know, like kind of these moments where we can see how it might play out. So I think kind of maybe thinking through what those more specific spaces might look like could help, yeah, also just tease out this world and this future a little bit further, because you've provided such a great kind of framework and infrastructure for us to be able to imagine those moments.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, in terms of like the narrative and having some conflict, I think it being sort of like a storytelling cinematic experience, like, you know, storyboarding and all that was super important to us. Yeah, I think more conflict, and also whenever this thing engages, like fully touches down to the ground, could be a great exploration. Also, in terms of like the conflict, we were proposing like humans, like this is a time for non-human species and animals and plants to really inhabit the earth in a way that humans have sort of taken away from them over the past like modern civilization. Yeah, but thank you very much for those comments. Yeah.
If I can add to that, and I mean, let's say though that as certain humans, you don't want to go on this thing because it's like, okay, I don't want to get a vaccine, so I don't want to go on the Maya, voyage. What happens? I mean, as going back to the conflict that Caitlin was talking about, but I mean, what kind of are you going to have? Two kinds of factions, ones which are pro that, and because I mean we know perfectly well, at least seeing it from Europe, on the European side of the world, how it's becoming polarized. It's extremely worrying. But in that sense, so I would throw in the mix of this discussion, what if there is a contrast in that? What if someone doesn't agree with that? What if someone doesn't want to come on board? I mean, I know that we talked about Noah's Ark at the beginning and that idea, but are you going to be wiping everybody out and only the people then again, who gets on there, which was the same idea of Noah's Ark, how do you decide who gets on there and who doesn't get on there? And I would like to know a little bit more. I know that, let's say we're talking about this, that is there, or is it a different kind of what we discussed in the morning, humanity? Is it a completely different? Are you also setting that as a utopian, let's say, population that agrees to these kind of rules? But then again, we're going to say, what are the rules? You have to be on this. You have to get vaccinated. But then we see what is happening in the world right now. So my question is, or at least my point would be, what happens, and in that sense, when we were saying, oh, why doesn't it touch the ground at certain points? Yes, what would happen then? Would there be a contrast? Would there be a different kind of interaction? Is there, so that would be interesting. I wanted to know if you had thought about that, because taking again, of course, all the kind of political that Ashraf and Frank talked about and everybody's talking about, I would like to understand also, even if you haven't thought about that, but what are your thoughts on this kind of, let's say?
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting, and I love how you relate it to like COVID and getting back the vaccination in today. Yeah, so in terms of like, if you could fly, if you don't have the vaccine, if you don't want to get it, that was a big point of discussion for us throughout the entire semester of like, yeah, who gets to be on this landmass? Is it selective? And our stance was, no, it's not selective. Anybody who wants to get on can get on. But obviously that's not like entirely realistic in certain scenarios. And we framed the narrative in terms of it's an education zone, it's a living space, and it's a place of shelter from superstorms and natural disasters. So part of our concept is the idea of humans returning to a nomadic state to avoid natural disaster. But to answer your question in short, no, we didn't really explore what would happen if you didn't board the landmass. And I think it'd be really interesting to explore that.
Perfect, thank you.
One other thing that I just was thinking about really quick, this could be a quick one, as I'm looking at your sections and your some of your renderings, which of course are really fantastic, fantastically drawn and constructed, but they do take certain things for granted and certain things at face value. And I'm looking at some of the trees in the sections, and made me think about trees and about what we think trees are. You know, we have, and they're kind of generic looking trees, and they're very lovely and beautiful trees, but they're trees. Like it's like if you did a Google image search for tree, that's what you would get. And we think we understand them. There's a book, it looks like Ava read it, which is great, or that you read it, The Hidden Life of Trees. There's this incredible kind of society, this community, this sort of series of relationships that are happening around us, but they're happening outside of our view, not only our physical eyeballs kind of view, but also our kind of mental construct kind of view, right? We can't see them because we can't think them. We can't think about the kinds of conversations that are happening between these organisms and how sophisticated their networks are. But we also can't see them because of the time scale, or I should say the speed at which they occur, right? It's as if we're living our lives in this sort of incredibly sped up, you know, time, you know, like fast motion, and in these networks of trees and roots and seeds traveling across forests, communities, et cetera, are happening at a speed that we literally cannot witness because they're just too slow for our physical apparatus of our eyeballs and other senses and so on. So I think a sensitivity to that might actually change the way you draw the trees and draw the root systems of these trees and what happens in those poché zones. And I think it's a representation issue. I think those sections could actually, as beautiful as they are, could get a lot more interesting and a lot messier and a lot, you know, let's flip the section and turn the poché into the project, and then what's rendered, let's turn that off for a second and let's see what's actually happening in the non-human space of that white poché. I think there's spaces within the project, both physical and sort of conceptual spaces, that could be unlocked further and actually begin to suggest that the way we even draw a section needs to be completely abandoned, because it too often masks the things that we can't see with our brains, with our conceptual apparatus, right? With our categorization systems and so on and so forth. And I think that might begin to unlock ways of tapping into this sort of non-human side of this project in a slightly richer way.
If I may add something also, you know, it's like fascinating discussion because it's also a fascinating project, really, in many respects, you know, and it took me a while also to look into other, you know, details of your drawing and go to the Miro board and check other aspects, you know, and something that came to mind, you know, architecturally speaking, or let's say spatially. So here you are constructing this project on the agenda that you are not going back to the Noah's Ark, but you are also problematizing that. Nonetheless, one reading is that you are still creating closed worlds, a closed environment that immediately gives the impression that the surrounding context is one of danger. And then the question that comes to mind, if you are really imagining a post-human future based on returning, as you put it, to a pre-human, let's say harmonious existence, let's put it in these words, then the question comes, wouldn't that mean that you don't need even to create this project, if that's the case? Because the whole planet will be safe enough that you don't need to create some protective enclaves or protective capsules. And, you know, I mean, maybe it's, I don't know if it's a little bit of a stretch to imagine a little affinity with Archigram and walking cities, especially in these points when you have the project or the world that you're creating touching the ground. And one of the critique, you know, for such, you know, visionary architecture in the 60s was that it operates within the Cold War aesthetics, and it has a certain affinity, for example, to the Buckminster Full Dome over Manhattan, where it's in the background you have this fear of a nuclear attack or, you know, a fallout, and you need shelter from that. That means that even if your narration was given to us in a very smooth, lacking friction, back to Caitlin's point, I think maybe deeper a little bit behind the scenes in your project, we can sense still that there is danger exists. And I don't know if you would agree with me with that, or that's my own reading imposed on your project. Because the question then will be again, why would you need to create such an enclosed world if the whole planet is safe now?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Yeah, the idea of enclosure is inherently suggests that there's danger. And I think that we were proposing this as a healer to the danger, and the idea of being an anti-arc as opposed to having humans and animals hop on board, take shelter for the storm, and then once it's done, be released. We want to actively, and that's something we try to depict in our drawings, is like as this thing travels, it's planting and it's healing, not just necessarily neglecting the dangers around it.
I mean, that description or that reframing actually makes me think about a coral reef as a kind of open system, right? And maybe there are some other kinds of more porous ways and material. I love the models that you showed, actually. I thought those were really provocative and could be taken even further. And I'm seeing the large openings, but I'm also seeing the kind of micro openings and the sort of breathability of that as a form, the kind of sponge, the porosity of that, and the relationship to something like a coral reef as a sort of as many things, as a physical structure, as a kind of societal sort of network of species and organisms, as a kind of cleansing kind of apparatus for the environment. And so maybe there are some other natural systems that could be precedent for projects like this. Maybe we need to, as much as we look at architectural precedent, and I completely was thinking of the Walking City as well, we should also be taking for this project just as seriously taking natural precedent as sort of literal kind of form giving or organizational models for a project like this.
If I can add to what Frank was saying and Ashraf was saying, when Ashraf, you were talking about the Buckminster Fuller, I was thinking of the Biosphere 2 experiment in the 90s, right? So, and what that led to. And so I was thinking, the social part is something which is extremely important to look at, because at the end it was one of the biggest failures. So, and it was enclosed, and they had species, and they had quite a lot of things inside. So I think that that's also a point that to really think about not only the social, but as far as the social interaction within the spaces. I'm not now talking about anymore between it and the world, but within the social interaction within, let's say, Maya, is how's that going to work? Because now I'm extremely interested in, okay, let's be completely utopian and not talk about what is left on Earth, but what is the social interaction within this? I mean, how our relationship's going to change? And like Frank was saying at the beginning, he's like, okay, do you have the same couch as you had? So everything is going to change. So how is that going to be? So it's really fascinating. But I mean, this is all because it's a project that as you can see, the discussion is there, and we're all very vehement on trying to discover more. So it means that you have a successful project, but that of course we want to see more as always.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also now thinking with this system of a kind of inside and outside, where you have the map of the infrastructure and these kind of green bands, and then there's these what looked like on the drawing like islands where those green kind of sleeves haven't reached yet. So I was thinking also, okay, well, what happens outside the system? Like, we're retracing these routes that you spoke to that. Of the colonial kind of legacy of infrastructure, and we're retracing those to regreen them, but then what happens kind of on the outside? So I think that these are good questions. And yeah, ones that your project brings up, and also then asks us to think too about the role of the various non-human actors within this. Seeds themselves travel. So would they kind of have their own paths, their own bands of greening outside of the lines of infrastructure? So yeah, so great questions that are being brought up here.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your comments and feedback. And I really enjoyed this discussion. I think it certainly has given me a lot to think about in terms of like where this could go next, what we may have looked over, and what could add completely other dimensions to this proposal.
Absolutely. These are really great comments. I know, Christian, maybe you wanted to jump in with something. We were sort of giving the floor to our invited guests, but we'd certainly love to hear from you if we have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Eva. I just wanted to, I was listening to this, to the discussion, really fabulous project, by the way. Really appreciate it. I guess one thing that I missed in the presentation was if you guys had thought about, I put it in the comments, if you guys had thought about entropy or kind of a post-Maya condition. You know, humans, of course, when they try to fix things, right? And then once things are fixed, then they go recolonize and the process starts again. So I wonder if you had thought about that kind of re-crisis or a post-Maya condition.
Yeah, thank you. We certainly have. We were imagining this sort of as a inevitable cycle in which, in terms of the Maya narrative, the toxicity becomes too much to bear. Humans have to travel to avoid these disasters. The cities and urban spaces become populated with humans, non-human, and it's completely overgrown with various species. And then in this depiction, we were touching on when humans do eventually come back into the space, they see that their once built environments were completely overgrown into these new ecologies. As sort of like, you know, it's 300 years, completely new generation of humans. There's sort of like a degree of primitive returning to life of like what will now be ruins from past humans, and then rediscovering these spaces, and hopefully living in symbiosis with the non-humans as they learn to do what avoided the Maya.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just wonder what happens to Maya in all of this, like when they kind of reoccupy the kind of regrown planet. What happened to these objects that were used to recolonize? Like, do they become part of that landscape, or are they just kind of dry docked somewhere?
That's really interesting. We haven't thought about what happens to the vessel itself. We were proposing that this is made from accumulated waste like plastics and just trash that's been scattered about the earth. But yeah, once this is no longer needed, what happens to it? That's a great question.
I got kicked out there for a moment, but I think this is maybe a good moment to wrap up. I wanted to really thank you all for the amazing conversation. This has been quite extraordinary, really jumping on a lot of the issues that we discussed, made us feel very uncomfortable also, right? There were sort of moments that like, well, this could go very quickly in a sort of really bizarre direction. And I think that the conversation shows that, and also the different ways in which it can be tackled, right? The political dimension, social, and yeah, so really appreciate also the references that you added in the chat. And I want to commend, you know, James and Ray, who's not here, but James for really also kind of engaging in the conversation and presenting it today. So well done, and thank you again, guests.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I look forward to looking at those references as well in the chat. So thank you.
Nice work.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it looks like we're about 5 minutes ahead of schedule, so we can move on to the next group. Lawrence and Deborah, your students project. Would you like to say anything?
Yeah, Deb's going to start and then I'll follow a little bit.
Right. And again, I don't know whether, I don't see who's on the chat, but if any of the curators of these sessions are on the chat, I have to say thank you, because I think even though we're looking at a near future contingent projects, some of the themes, some of the discussion pertains, and it will be fun to carry it on. We were our project framework was called psychosocial densities. So in other words, it was dealing with social, emotional, economic, etc., psychological dimensions of physical density and ideas that pertain to it. So overcrowding, how it differs from density, sparseness, closeness, distance, all the different terms that flow from that subject in the context, the prompt being the COVID environment, which our students were experiencing firsthand, which urbanistically has also brought into question urban density. You'll remember all the conversations around overcrowding versus density and the flight from the city. And like many crises, revealing underlying vulnerabilities and bringing cultural assumptions into questions. So this thing that had been assumed to be the best model of a diversity, community, and physical sustainability, we're being challenged. So what does density look like, and what are its alternatives in terms of settlements, ways of life, notions of well-being? And then with Lawrence and Paul, we opened up the study through a series of questions, smaller questions and themes that Lawrence will speak to.
So those kind of sub-themes became a kind of preliminary genealogy that we gave the students, and then a way they developed their projects, let's say, spun out of. But we looked at different kinds of, for instance, our research examined historical and present forms of density. Deborah talked about this, and such topics as urban plague, utopian enclaves and traditions, the suburbs, and other forms of exurban development. And then, of course, global examples, innovation in co-housing and shared resources. And of course, finally, human science and environmental health. So we were hoping that programmatically too, it might lead to ideas that dealt with questions and issues of physical and social well-being, emergent lifestyles and post-familial households, and capacities for economic and environmental sustainability. And Deborah's already talked about, as well as what that would mean for certain kinds of settlement character and their internal organization. So I think that's a good segue into this project. These two are terrific, so I'm looking forward to a great conversation. I'm going to leave it to Vicky and Patty to take it away.
Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Victoria. And my name is Patricia. All right, there we go. Before we start presenting, we just want to remind you that in both of the Miro boards shared on the chat, you could see the drawings that we're going to present, as well as other extra animations that we worked on. So this is cross-cultural cultivating, the architecture of hybridized spatial traits. The current large-scale crisis of forced migration due to political, economical consequences or climate migration around the world has led thousands of people from a global southeast to the northwest. The resettlement of refugee populations has often led to further trauma, not only through the journey of migration itself, but also after arriving in a new environment. Cross-cultural cultivating reinterprets the physical and cultural sense of home that displaced refugees are longing for, and transplants it into a new setting, as well as revitalizes the charged history of an abandoned site. By addressing the desire to return to a former time or to a former home, we focus on how architecture can ease traumas of displacement, as well as past traumas of the receiving country. The project aims to use architectural traits as a tool for effectively crossing two distinct cultures, the German local and the Syrian immigrant, through a syntax that merges both visual and spatial conditions of the new inhabitants and locals' physical past.
We create mechanisms of exchange in different aspects ranging from technological, cultural, economical, and social. Supported by the interaction of programs that include housing and food production, we allow arriving refugees to adapt to their new home by bringing their former agricultural work lives into the city, allowing them to cultivate their future.
The project challenges for a radical adaptive reuse and therefore focuses on institutions that were left behind. Limitations dictated by the previously institutionalized organization forces an unexpected hybrid when introducing new programs that do not usually belong to this building typology. While the immigrants give life back to the abandoned site, locals receive a revitalized space that preserves its previously valued German history, leading to an interdependent relationship between both cultures. This hybrid exchange eases the known tension between both cultures, allowing for this hybrid community to find commonalities between their differences.
The chosen site is an abandoned children's home in the southeast of the city, near the Spree River. Built in 1953 and abandoned in 1998, used East Germany's largest orphanage, conceived to be a self-contained, self-sufficient town. It included a school, a sports facility, an outpatient clinic, and residences. The project stimulates both the local context and the new occupants to transform each other. After studying Unger's urban concept of the Green Archipelago, the proposal challenges the concept of separation in the shrinking Berlin of the 1970s to propose a new, more interconnected and permeable ecosystem of inclusion for the increasingly growing city of Berlin.
The site is located within a forest and surrounded by multiple green spaces that range from green trails to allotment gardens. The surrounding nature provides a shielding layer that could offer a protective feeling for the refugees while they adjust to the new stimulating environment. Engaging with the long German tradition of allotment gardens, which are already abundant around the site, the project introduces a food production program for the new residents to grow crops. This way, the new program invites the German population to come in and learn about new agricultural techniques, exchanging the dynamic between guest and local throughout the project. The linear axis of the existing site acts as the stem of the project, branching out to connect the different programs. Through an agricultural recontextualization, we created a number of operations at different scales based on implanting new technologies for food production, as well as nesting courtyards to break the rigidity of the building, and clustering the residential programs to create a sense of community.
The proposal studies the original organization, vital spatial conditions, and atmospheres of the courtyard Islamic house and the Syrian bazaar as the main design strategy, by reinterpreting and translating Syrian atmospheres to fit within the contrasting rigid German site. An unpredicted spatial experience is shaped, one that falls in neither one of the hybridized architectural characters. As you can see, we merged both the Syrian market vault with the existing building restriction, trying to imitate the atmospheric conditions that were created by the sunlight coming from above. Playing with the vault in elevation and in plan, we reinterpreted the spaces so that this atmospheric condition would still be present, but with a different form and shape.
Through a series of physical studies, we were able to play with materiality and color and explore how different forms were able to shape varying relationships between light and shadow.
As the master plan shows, the design generates a new mixed-use building typology that integrates food production and housing within the existing boundaries of the site. The main three elements of the proposal are the housing residences, located towards the back of the site for privacy, the market, introduced near the entrance as a welcoming layer, and the greenhouses that are inserted into both programs. The project uses the central axis of the existing site as a transitional experience going from public to private.
The aim is to create a common ground where residents and visitors can come together no matter their background and grow as a shared community. Both newly arrived Syrian refugees and long-term locals are able to possibly meet through these circulation scenarios. So we've worked on this possible circulation scenarios where possibly a German could come in, experience the underground market, go to cooking classrooms, to cooking classes given by the Syrians, and then wander through exterior agricultural plots. Then Syrian adults go from the residence to work at a large-scale greenhouse, and then go to additional programs that we've added to cover their adjustment into a new setting, such as legal offices and German learning centers. How a German neighbor could come in, he probably could be the owner of an allotment garden. He can come in and learn about the new technologies being developed and also sell their products in the market. And then the Syrian child could go to, again, the supplementary programs as a daycare center, play at the green areas, and as such. And then the organization of the overall program and complex is made so that these possible points of meeting could be incremented.
Zooming into one pre-existing building, we introduced industrial-scale greenhouses for crops that later become produce to be sold in the underground market. A very common challenge faced by the refugees is the lack of job opportunities, which limits their ability to contribute to society. In response to this, the structure enables a work exchange, where they are able to grow crops year-round through developing agricultural techniques that will allow them to generate income while selling their produce. Food becomes the essence of the project. Because food creates a common middle ground, the greenhouses as well as the exterior agricultural spaces will grow crops that are familiar to both Germany and Syria. Below the greenhouses, we find all the additional spaces needed for the production of food, including storages, packaging, and tool rooms. The main market structure introduces an underground linearity that resembles the organizational traits of a Syrian bazaar, such as a street-like circulation that leads the visitors from one side to the other. In addition to these spatial qualities, the proposal regenerates how light is being filtered into the market. Vaults, similar to those common in Syrian market architecture, provide openings for these light filterings to occur, while also creating visual connections across levels, as shown here in section. Above the underground market, there are communal spaces for dining, as well as rooms for cooking classes, which enable greater opportunities for social interaction.
To feel comfortable in their new homes, refugees will try to reconstruct the concept of their original homes. Cross-cultural cultivating recognizes the importance of memory for the transitional process by introducing the familiar typology of the courtyard. In the history of Islamic residences, the courtyard always represents a protected communal space, which is why we nested this element into the existing building. In addition, the central element of the courtyard becomes the greenhouses as a way to reinterpret the original connections to water, food, smells, and nature found in the traditional Syrian house. This includes the introduction of a year-round food production that encourages the self-sufficient idea that the original children's home once had. Food is central to all cultures, but is also what enables a sense of cultural distinction and collective memory. The hybridization strategies also play a performative role. The introduction of new layers within the industrial scale allow for the transformation of the existing load-bearing walls where they could function as strong walls. By introducing a solar chimney into the greenhouses, the temperature inside the space can be controlled to maintain the perfect environment for the different crops in distinct seasons of Berlin. The roof is transformed by replacing its existing tiles with innovative color PV cells. These colors were inspired by those found in the decorative interiors of the original Syrian courtyards. Hence, these are still present, but now through the color light. In these views, we're starting to showcase the experience of this world that we have created. In this case, a large production scale of the greenhouses, the interior of the courtyard of a residence, the underground market, and then the linearity that we have recreated through the form making.
The overall sections showcase the interior and exterior relationships between all the pieces of the project, going from the market to the external agricultural crops that connect to the residences, as well as the greenhouses. The current refugee housing crisis will continue to grow as political, social, and environmental tensions rise all over the world, leading to the need for more cross-cultural cultivating projects. The proposal hopes to cross cultures beyond architectural spaces to produce a well-translated environment for a strong hybrid community and an inclusive social ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So maybe I can start just to get the discussion going. So thank you for, again, wonderful project, very ambitious agenda and arguments and proposal, and definitely very pressing issues, Syrian refugees and issues of migration. So it's very loaded subject and incredible project, I have to say. So I congratulate you definitely on all of that. So I'm definitely fascinated with different aspects of your project. The approach to reuse an existing building, taking the project as an educational facility, the idea of mixed use, focus on bringing different cultures together. So all these are fascinating. I would just raise also some maybe questions and some, it's not necessarily a critique, but things, I'm again, just take this as open for different ideas or different things. I would say, I was maybe, I think, the fact that you immediately, or at least in your presentation, alluded to the market as a typology, and alluded to Islamic arches and architecture as an element of or at least as a device that will bring, some familiarity to the refugee and will help educate the German audience and hence initiate a hopeful integration. I would actually problematize that move a little bit. Not to deny, the ambition behind it, but just to make it a little bit, to make all of us a little bit aware of caution, because that move is based on certain assumption. It's based that in a particular on the idea that a particular architecture typology or that a whole culture with all its complexity, like the Syrian culture, can be summed up in one typology or in one aspect. And that might lean a little bit, I'm not saying you're doing this, but might have some Orientalist implication that you don't intend to have, which is the idea that you look at a certain culture as frozen in history, and as can be summed up in one iconic, and the critique, for example, that has been developed towards the term Islamic architecture, even the word Islamic itself, as if that architecture for these regions is solely defined by religion. So I would say something here, again, it's not quite there, but maybe a little bit, maybe something you should be aware of a little bit. For example, from the little I know, from the little I read about the Syrian refugees, is that the Germans or the European audience were amazed about how well educated they are. And even also how also some segments were maybe even too secular and not necessarily adhering to a particular religious or traditional practice, or how modern they were. So I think that's very important to bring in mind when you think about integrating culture. The second point, I think, has to do maybe with the project itself and the architecture approach. As fascinating as this is, the question comes to mind if this is still a site that has boundaries and a particular plot that has limits. So still there is a clear marcation between who is inside and who's outside. And even when you want to promote integration, still the German residents, they will still come to visit. So it's not an integration that's taking scale on the larger city, and it's not an integration that's taking place on the everyday life. It's as if you are going to a museum and like, sorry for like bringing this into discussion, but it's more as if they are coming to watch the Syrian refugees perform in a certain way. And then the question, is that really the best way to integrate two different cultures? Perhaps maybe if the project was dispersed inside the city, maybe in a more, again, that's a question. I'm not saying that this is one is better than the other, but it's just thanks to your project, these questions are raised. Anyway, but thank you, I appreciate it. Great work.
Thank you for your comments. In a way, connecting to that idea, we sort of thinking of it as well as there's many abandoned sites in Berlin, and maybe if the refugee crisis will continue to grow, then other abandoned sites could also become a sort of community in which it could be integrated more into the city. But I completely agree with what you were saying.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe to build on some of the threads that Ashraf brought up, and again, great project. I really appreciate the really thoughtful way you're thinking through exactly how this would work and its attentiveness to to detail in how the greenhouses and the market would actually operate, and the seriousness that you approach that with. And when you first introduced the project and showed a map with the allotment gardens and then various green spaces in Berlin, I think it's a great point that there's a tradition of gardening in Berlin, and that people everywhere have gardening practices and agricultural methods, and that this can be a way for people to come together and have a shared interest and work together. And so I had initially thought, okay, maybe like these are going to be allotment gardens where it's like, everyone is kind of gardening together, and it's German gardeners and Syrian gardeners. And so I get the impulse to have this be a way for job creation and job opportunity. But I think that, kind of maybe to Ashraf's point also about creating a bit more like permeability, that I thought it would be really nice actually if it was a space where anyone from the community can come garden, and maybe that actually extends into some of the other green spaces, like these great parks and stuff. So it becomes a bit more of these agricultural kind of lines reaching out into the city. So that was, one comment. And I was also thinking, I think it's really nice that to provide, meaningful opportunities for work and to do work that, is productive and meaningful. But I was also thinking, what about, are there other forms of employment that could happen for those who are not agriculturally inclined or have different training and education? And I know your project isn't to like think about kind of the solution to everything, but I was like, in this kind of structure, that's maybe another option, so that it doesn't just reduce the opportunities available to working in the greenhouse, that there could be other sort of facilities within this. So, you could come to the greenhouse and maybe there's like a dental clinic there and someone gets to work in the dental clinic or something like that. But again, it does set up, I think, a really nice way to think about how to reactivate spaces in the city and to bring communities together.
Thank you.
If I could just add a real quick comment here. I'm on slightly borrowed time. That's probably obvious based on my camera angle here. But I wanted to mention that what beautiful drawings, a great idea. I love the poetry of housing the newly kind of minted members of this community in the German orphanage. There's something kind of poetic about the symmetry in that I love dearly. And the one thing about earlier Ashraf's comments about the dangers of creating a situation where the borders between the communities might continue to exist because of the nature of the transactions that this project sets up, is that's worth thinking carefully about. The only thing I would add to that, because he did qualify that may or may not be a good thing, there could be some positives. I'd say that full integration probably trends towards mediocrity. There's something nice about the kind of variety that comes from understanding the city is broken up into quarters, and this could be the genesis of something as beautiful as that. The one thing I think is missing from the presentation is a true is a moment where you get to relish the architectural drama that comes from cutting into the existing buildings with these wonderful glass insertions. I didn't see documentation that captured what is bound to be an amazing set of experiential circumstances. I feel like the documentation kind of just keeps that a bit at arm's length. But it could be something you circle back and capture with a little, with some of your free time coming up. I hate to give you another assignment, but it's a wonderful project, and congratulations.
Thank you so much.
If I can add to that, to what everybody was saying. So I think that maybe one of, because I was thinking while everybody was making comments, how would one react to that? I think that maybe one of the issues that makes this, let's say, even more difficult is the footprint of the existing, meaning that the site that you've picked and these kind of buildings have a hierarchy and set up a whole kind of, let's say, topography of buildings that then becomes harder and harder to have this kind of integration, because the minute that I look at this, it's trying to insert, of course, within the, within Berlin. And I mean, we can also discuss Berlin and farmers, because the weather in Berlin, I've lived in Berlin, it is not the best, but that aside, I'm just wondering, and whether I would, let's say, push you to modify even more the existing building, not to be so proper, but to be, since you are trying to, it's very elegant, it's very elegantly done, maybe too elegant, because if you're going to try to have this kind of strong interaction and this kind of new interaction, which neither the Germans nor the Syrians are used to, it should be, let's say, a different kind of language, a different kind of architectural language. I mean, I find it very, like someone said, kind of elegant, because you're integrating very politically correct certain things that come from Syria and certain things that, but maybe that's not the solution. Maybe the solution is something which you don't really recognize, that doesn't belong to one nor the other, because I think that that's one of the issues that one would have, is like, okay, this is us and this is them, and while instead it's none of us. It's a new hybrid language which does not, and in that sense, that's why I would say, okay, let's try to change the architecture. And that's why I'm saying, and initially before I was letting everybody go through, because I'm like, yeah, but what is it really? And maybe it's the fact that the footprint and the actual buildings that are there impose a kind of hierarchy, impose a kind of, master planning that you've done. But then my saying, what? But what if you do something even more? Because I love the idea of integrating, and it can be poetic, but sometimes it's not about poetry. It's about, it's about moments that come together, and then you create something new. And I would also leave maybe one completely empty for them to inhabit their own way, meaning create certain spaces, because I mean, I've realized more and more that people need to appropriate their space. So being so polite in giving them, what we think they would want. I mean, I know that every time that, we do an architecture, then the beauty is how the public appropriates it, right? So give them also the space, because this kind of integration is a different kind of integration, which I find extremely interesting. So it would be interesting to give them a possibility of giving them the tools to then do something completely different also on their own. But great project. Thank you.
I think those are excellent remarks, actually. And I think linking back to what Ashraf said earlier, this idea of doing something far less regimented, it doesn't mean you have to change your project. It's just about implying and maybe retro engineering if you like, the co-design dimensions within your projects, and what way could the residents adulterate these environments in some way to make them more culturally sensitive and specific. I mean, Germany's interesting as a country. It's taken more refugees than any other country, I think, there's about 130,000 Iraqi refugees and about 125,000 Afghanis before we even get to talk about Syria. But if you think a bit about what the IKEA project is, I'm sure you've studied that. And maybe it's just the renderings, but seeing kind of white boxes, which is always symbolic of conflict and refugees, is I often think, well, in some ways it's a clinical space. It absolutely resonates in with regimental aesthetics, perhaps, and even, you know, historically a residue of modernist aspirations. But I also think of these, if you like, these walls as blank canvases for that kind of interaction. So in some ways, this is just about an amelioration you could offer to the drawings you've produced. How could you allow them to be adapted and reconfigured? Interestingly, the refugee shelters that were created by IKEA, I think something like $12 million worth of them are just redundant because it took one to burn down. And I know we haven't quite engaged in the conversation around, you know, this idea of materiality and its performance relative to heating and fire and so on. But, you know, glass presents a certain set of challenges, doesn't it? And I think that somewhere else is the idea of, you know, transparency being poetic in some way, because it's about having a visibility within a community. And it also, you know, just more generally, in terms of the environment it creates for growing strategies, that's incredible. But also there are other more hazardous implications that aren't necessarily dystopian, but could form part of the narrative that you could use to fuel some alternative illustrations about how long this space is useful for. So what would be a residency period? How long would anyone necessarily live in it? I mean, statistically, refugees, normally the average lifespan of a refugee in a refugee camp internationally is actually 15 years, which is quite appalling. That's a global statistic. And it always really concerns me that anyone would have to live in any kind of refugee infrastructure. And what you've done is obviously produce something that would be entirely habitable and might not want to move people on. But I'd love to know more about how you imagine people might engage with this particular facility and then go on and have other kinds of existences, other kinds of lives, and potentially even return to things that they do normally, because that's one of the interesting things, isn't it? It's the middle classes from countries with conflict that have the means to escape, the poor do not. And often that's why there's so many really highly qualified people who do move to Europe or elsewhere as refugees, because they've had the ability to do that. But then there's a whole skill set that comes with them, which means they might not want to go from being a brain surgeon to a farmer. So I think there's some dimension about how there could be a temporality to this, which would allow an afterlife. And that could be perhaps just, and like somebody else said earlier, an extra couple of drawings about the lifespan of this in terms of the users in habitation. Just a thought anyway. And it really is about embellishing an otherwise very strong and clearly very provocative project. So thank you.
If I could comment on that. We did a lot of research of the process that happens once the refugees come into Berlin and the entire legal process of it. So in a way, we wanted to add the idea of the legal officers so that they could learn more about the process of just the paperwork, and even to get into other areas of work, they would need to still provide to society and provide an income in a way. So that's in a way why we wanted to include the idea of the legal officer, so that the refugees could have a connection to someone that understands the process of the paperwork, so that they could eventually continue their professions, but still allowing them to provide for their families and provide for the German community, which is one of the main things that allows them to get their residence paperwork. So in a way, we did want to create this sort of permanent space, but still allowing them to continue with their professional lifestyle after.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I believe we imagine this being as a starting point for them. So that's why we added the secondary programs to the German center for them to learn the language. And then yes, since this is a starting point for them to get an income through the farming, and then after they get their paperwork done, they should have some of the abilities to expand after, like, beyond this complex, I guess.
This slide, I think, is a really interesting one because it speaks. I'm fascinated by this project. I mean, there's certainly much at stake in this project, and I applaud you for taking it on. I think it mixes some really incredibly rich topics. This one speaks to the idea of master planning, the idea of a kind of, let's say, sort of network of specific, in this case, very highly specific programmatic elements that occupy this kind of, this framework. But I think, and so some of the other layers, of course, are adaptive reuse, which is probably what I'd like to kind of land on the most in these comments. And then also the incredibly kind of loaded and rich topic of the refugee crisis itself and the cultural kind of conditions that puts on the table. With adaptive reuse, I think, and master planning itself, I think there's got to be, I love this word that came up about co-creation, and I think there's got to be a kind of framework for co-creation, which I think architecturally demands a certain generosity and flexibility of space making that in some cases is counter to some of the pieces you've made here. I think that there's a kind of middle scale that your project operates on architecturally that is highly bespoke and highly kind of, these insertions are not flexible. They are highly specific kind of, and very visible. There's a kind of, and even of course the way you represent it, which has been talked about, there's a sort of, there's the white box that you found, and then there's the sort of more animated pieces that you insert. And in fact, adaptive reuse is much more subtle than that, right? There are buildings all over Manhattan that are being, that are 100 years old and are now being used, you know, in ways that are completely, were completely unintended to be used when these buildings were built. And it's not because the architecture itself has changed, it's because they've been, you know, outfitted with new infrastructure, with incredible amounts of, you know, cabling for data communications, you know, air handling systems that allow them to operate with lots more people because they, you know, you know, I'm thinking of buildings that were used for storage and things like, you know, truck loading, and now they're being used for high-tech office space, and they don't look much different from the outside. You actually can't tell that these buildings are incredibly modern and hyper modern on the inside, right? And so this project wears its kind of architecture on its sleeve in a way that I think is slightly going against what you're trying to produce, which is a kind of a canvas for life to unfold in ways that you probably can't quite predict. And I think there are ways around that. I think you can have your cake and eat it too. I mean, I think it is important to have some of these more highly symbolic kind of elements of architecture, but I think, you know, providing or inserting spaces into this very linear kind of architecture of the existing orphanage, you could connect buildings with large span structures that you don't program, and you allow for flexible use, right? You can enclose courtyards. You can take 2 bars and add a 3rd bar and create a kind of space between buildings, which I don't think is leveraged in these. And I think there are these typologies like long span structures and courtyard spaces that would allow for that process of co-creation to take place within this framework that is less kind of predetermined in advance of the kind of new occupants, right? And so there's got to be, I think, this generosity and this flexibility that can exist alongside some of the more specific architectural moments that I think you're very passionate and capable of designing. You know, you're clearly passionate about design, and so you sort of want to make these spaces that showcase that. But I think you can leverage that, or let's say support those by these more kind of almost utilitarian sort of flexible, generous spaces that allow for future use and interpretation.
Hey, Frank, I appreciate your comments quite a bit, and as well as a lot of the ones before. I wanted to return a bit to some of Ashraf's discussion at the beginning of the conversation regarding what might have been a borrowed form because I think one of the things that the project is doing and really championing for is it is screaming for a place in society for this class of individuals. And it's taking that, and as you said, wearing it on its sleeve, but it's doing it through the process of the geometric by destabilizing what would be the Western typology that it's adopting. And I think for that reason, the geometric intervention is extremely important in this project. And it's extremely important to see the wrestling match happening between the two types of architectures. And what I do think is fantastic is that it is not, I would argue that it has gone to a point where it has shed perhaps any form of adoption. I don't think you needed to present it in relationship to Islamic architecture, quite honestly, at this point, Vicky and Patty, because it's no longer resembling that in any form. To your credit, it's kind of gone through a series of mutations that is no longer geometrically of any ilk, except it's kind of it resembles that wrestling match happening in physicality. Where I think I am in agreement with a lot of the critics, though, at this point in the semester, and is how this engages a larger urban project. And one of the challenges that I'm a little concerned about is that I think the comment about this being hermetically sealed for just this population is a really strong one. And I do wonder what the programming could have been to actually perhaps infrastructurally solve some problems in the German city on its borders, so that there's more interface between existing locals and the inside of the compound. I think perhaps one of the places where you could have done that, and I think actually maybe not in this image, I found there was a lot of really ingenuity to break down the typological tyranny of the existing buildings through the use of the underground. And I wonder if that could have been matriculated into a border or a fringe condition that actually was programming and perhaps subverted the local, or actually subdued the local by really raising the new population up hierarchically, not in a way that is above, but then also perhaps programming below and kind of using that as a sectional connection to the outer context. So I think that that question of how do you hybridize and at what scale do you hybridize is a very political question, because right now I can understand the critics feeling that the othering of these existing typologies is done subordinate to the figuration of their original forms. It is working at the scale of the building, but your kind of underground tactics have the possibility to subvert the hermetically sealed buildings in relationship to the outer compound. And that's what I would have liked to have seen develop a bit more as an infrastructural project for the larger city, and perhaps not just an internal compound discussion.
I would like actually, sorry, are you responding, or can I say something?
Oh, you can go.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. And so
They
just
hear enough of me, they don't have to respond to me.
No. I didn't mean to interrupt. Thank you. Again, it's such a rich discussion. Again, speaks to the the wonderful project that you have, and looking through the Miro board, I'm finding more and more things that such a rich, like honestly, something that rose my curiosity. To be honest with you, I'm still thinking about many of things and about many of the questions that your project poses. So you had this axonometric where you had these programs, the labels of the programs. And it's very fascinating. I don't know if you can go back to that,
yeah.
If you don't mind. Thank you.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. With the program, yeah, when you had yeah, excellent. Thank you. Because two things came to mind, looking at, and again, it's not that you have to cover everything, or yes, this one. No, there was another one. Yeah, excellent. That's the one. So two things actually I would have loved to see. And again, I didn't think about that before, but just looking at this diagram or this axonometric, I would have loved to see two things. And maybe there's just like a side note, but I think they might contribute to trying at least to steer your project away from any possible Orientalist reading, I think, in my view. I would like to see an Arabic learning center, for example, and not just a German learning center. And second, I would like to learn more about the current conflict, the main cause of why we have this Syrian refugee to start with. And that will be very important, I think, in two aspects. First, it will bring us to the present moment, and it will show the socio-political and economic factors that contributed to the problem. So we don't just look at culture in itself as something isolated from other dimensions of society. And I think it will bring also a global dimension to the problem. So maybe a German citizen might think, why do I have to take some refugees? Why do I have to do, I mean, me as a German, I have nothing to do with that. But maybe an educational facility, as you're proposing, when you try to analyze the factors of the conflict, the global conflict, that it had to do with the Arab Spring uprising, and then the dictatorship in Syria that reacted in an aggressive way, and then actually Western intervention and outside intervention that made the problem worse and made it reach a deadlock. So I think these are very important educational material, I think, to the visitor to your project, that I think you might also think about adding them up. That's the only thing. So thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe we could talk a bit about the interrelationships within one of the buildings, specifically how the room strategy starts to change and alter the existing technology. Could you kind of walk us through maybe a plan of how the new program or in geometry starts to alter the existing framework?
Yes.
Maybe you could do the apartments. Those are pretty interesting too.
Yeah. Right. So this is assuming of one of our apartments. So we're doing cluster apartments basically, where both of these two different apartments are basically joined by the greenhouse. And we really tried to relate this back to the organization of the original Syrian courtyard house. So for example, in the second floor plan, we tried to make the first floor plan very communal, and then the second floor plan, the rooms are surrounding the courtyard that in this case becomes the greenhouse. Then the courtyard is also being protected by introductions that we did to create this like more secure place where this also in the summer could extend to be a more open and bigger kitchen, considering that cooking is such an essential activity in the Syrian culture. And again, you can also notice some of these being lighter than the outside walls. These we really try to use as much of the original existing walls of the existing buildings so that the reconstruction wouldn't need more material than the ones that we could use.
And then try to connect to the exterior with having their own agricultural plots for them to also grow in the exterior if they wanted to, apart from the greenhouse. So trying to really create clusters of apartments as well as bringing a communal side to it with the exterior plots as well as the courtyards and the greenhouses.
Maybe we should just go back to the market. And then just to re-highlight the linearity that we found on the underground. And then the relationship between that we try to do by carving the building to create like a more open space between the outside crops and then trying to invite people into the interior.
Anything else from any of the critics?
Ladies, do you want, did you want to also just talk, you know, to engage these wonderful comments? I know you had some thoughts. You did some research about the Syrian population that is most likely to come to Berlin. Did you not?
Yes, that's why we mainly form their agricultural lives. That's one of the main important aspects. And then that also a lot of the Syrian population that's coming are children. So that's why we really try to emphasize the idea of the daycare. And so in the case in the case of the Syrian adults needed to work, then they could still have a place where they could take the children while they work.
Right.
And as well as allowing them to have green spaces where they could play around and learn about different crops.
So it's really a subculture of the Syrian culture that this is addressed to, right?
Yeah, there were many conversations about the, as was mentioned today, the highly educated population, to the point this could have just been a hospital. We talked all about all the amazing Syrian doctors. So in a way, you know, that was not left aside, but these are really important points. But, you know, this became, as Deborah said, a kind of
the notion, yeah, was that the people, the highly educated, are disperse themselves within the urban context more. It's more porous to them. You know?
Yeah, so it could be very interesting to see a kind of satellite. I mean, Ashraf, you alluded to this, another kind of satellite, more atomized strategy that would then take other expertise and cultural exchange. That, you know, it could just be a single building. It could be an office, right? So I think it'd be interesting to understand the kind of thing as a variegated set of approaches.
Right. I mean, I think this isn't, I think the comments are really wonderful, because in that way you could deal with the self-segregation within the Syrian community, right? You know, that every society has its classist and employment distinctions. So why, in a certain sense, reiterate them? It could be, so I think, these are wonderful things to open up your thesis even more. I mean, I know this was understood. Also, you can talk a little bit, this was understood to be one of many, as you say, of the potential sites of this kind of, you want to go back to the big map?
Yeah, go to the institutional, the one where you're looking at the abandoned.
And all these, it's really wonderful, because these comments are all ways to bring those ideas forward in your thesis, to highlight them, to expand them, you know, to make it truly kind of live as an urban strategy. Right.
Can I make a comment?
Cultivate them. In seed.
Yeah.
I was just thinking one thing, that you were talking about the children, and that's the real potential, right?
Yeah.
Because the children are the ones that are going to be blurring the boundaries, because between children, between the German children and the Syrian children, there is no idea of the hierarchy. There is no preconceived notion. And so I love the idea of that's putting it again on its head. What about the children? Because the children are the future, right? And Mary was saying that, you know, if it's something that they're going to be there 15 years, when they get there, they're the new generation, which needs to be integrated within the society. So it's not, I would, you know, think much more about the children. How could the children be vectors within the city of bringing people in, of interacting? Because with other children, that's, I mean, this is what I learned every time that, how did you meet? We met through our children. Oh, okay. You know, so that idea is something which should be pushed much more. And right now when you said, oh yeah, because there's also the children, I'm like, wait, you got it. That's it. The children are one of the solutions that will help tabula rasa and start again with all the preconceived notions. So I would think much more and implement it even more on the children, on the possibility of the children to interact with other children, because there is no, it's a completely different kind of way of seeing each other. So yeah, that would be.
Well, in a certain sense, this is a kindergarten, isn't it?
Oh, we're on the same wavelength, Deb. I just wrote that.
Yeah, it is I think it comes down to the interaction over the shared activity of the, not that an Arabic Learning Center isn't a fabulous idea, but the interaction over a shared activity with shared values seems, if this truly were understood, if it were enhanced in its presentation of as a kindergarten, which it is, could be really wonderful.
I have a question.
It is really
Sorry,
wonderful from that point of view.
Yes, definitely. No, I mean, this again, like really amazing issues and questions, but something also a question that when you mentioned the research, and I'm really fascinated by this aspect. Was there a sense, or is there any way to find out who wanted maybe, or if the majority or some of the refugee envisioned returning back to Syria? Like, was that?
That's a good question.
Yeah, was that taken into consideration? That I know, I mean, that I love the transient aspect of the project, and I think it's really important to emphasize that this is an ongoing process. But then the question comes to mind: is it one-way future? Is it just integrating into the German society, or I don't know the answer, or maybe of them actually, especially if they had a higher class status, let's say, bringing the point that Deborah articulated about class, and the importance of class, of course, and gender and all of that in any society. Would there some segments of the refugee who wanted actually to go back when the situation improves in Syria?
I would say we watched a lot of documentaries and videos to really understand the perspective from the Syrian itself and from that side of the problematic, and most of them did not really look into the future. They were mostly speaking about how they wanted to get the permanent residence status in Berlin, and that's through the entire process of getting a job and then learning German and everything. So that's sort of, I don't think, at least the ones that we were looking at, we're not really looking into the future as further as just like we need a new place to live. For how long, we don't know, but we still need to adjust to the place and to learn the culture.
Yeah, and what Vicky's saying is that at the moment they were very scared of thinking about going back, but I think that the project allows for the possibility for them to just, if there is a possibility that in the future they could go back to their country, they still, through this project, they were able to work in their farmers' lives again. So we try to look for as many commonalities between the cultures as we could. So if there's a small possibility for them to go back in the future, they still develop skills that would be helpful for them back in the country, not necessarily where they stayed in Germany.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I think that's, is there anything else? I think we're almost out of time here. Well, I'll just say it's been a pleasure. And I think that you're brave, you're innovative, and you are terrific students. So it's been a real pleasure for you to take on all these different issues and try to find some of the wedges that exist through the kind of discipline of architecture.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for all the comments.
Yes.
Very helpful. Great to work with you on this project. And it really is taking on some of the most pressing and urgent issues and most challenging. So really great that you were able to take on the challenge.
Great. And with all these wonderful comments, I wish I could work with you on it for another semester.
Yeah.
See where you take it.
Keep cultivating it because it has so much potential.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have the final project, which is from the studio Adam and I taught. Adam, if you want to say a couple words.
Sure. Yes, I will. Thank you, Lori. So yeah, for the benefit of those who are not here in the morning, our degree project section has kind of been, we've kind of had the running title of DP Magic over the past 3 years. Originally, the general thematic is the relationship between architecture and a very broad definition of the term magic. When I started this with Michelle Gorman 3 years ago, we were focusing on aspects of magic that included sort of deception, illusion, etc. Things relating to kind of the performance of magic. And over time, the studio has followed the course towards magic as a practice of sort of power. We became more interested in the relationship between magic and sort of social justice and kind of social relationships, and started looking at practices that would sort of delineate alternative models of reality, including the occult, paranormal, supernatural, the alchemical, where we could kind of look at the blurred ontological territory between thought and matter, where magicians and architects could produce phenomenological effects, evoke psychological affects, and negotiate the boundary between the community and the other. This is, I'm sort of paraphrasing from our research brief. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass it to our students, Abby and Aaron, who will lead us into their project. We did it our way.
Thank you, Adam.
I want to show you something. All this is empty. They built a new plant in Mexico and took all the work to Mexico.
For factory support, which is the guys that are making $14.35, their new proposal is $11 an hour, which means they would lose $3.35 an hour on their wage.
One of the big hot button issues in Detroit is the layout of the city. And right now there's questions about what parts of the city may be shrunk.
I don't know if y'all understand, but they shutting down schools. They shutting down futures, basically.
We're not going to accept any more downsizing. We want to hear about upsizing, big sizing, supersizing Detroit.
Good afternoon, critics and our fellow peers. My name is Abhishek. I'm Aaron, and our project is titled We Did It Our Way. In spite of billions in funding from all levels of government and all sides of the political spectrum, Detroit has failed to curb its decay. The failure of industry and the consequences of the affluent consumer lifestyle that characterizes mainstream American culture have yielded a plethora of abandoned homes and discarded consumer objects. To put it simply, Detroit has too much land for too few people. What we are proposing is then a retooling of Detroit's deteriorating urban fabric that uses the city's overabundance of land and unclaimed material as a basis of expansion and new construction.
The project hones in on how bricolage comes into play to drive forward a user-oriented system to how housing and urban dwelling and bring about a new understanding of the image of suburbia that is emergent from the bricolage of suburban parts and scrap material, while also encouraging bottom-up community-oriented approach to suburban densification. What we are proposing is a program for community growth that corresponds to the desires of the individual that compose it. It involves their own labor in order to push forward a generative economy that helps their own situations. What is required then in the role of the architect and designer is not to produce a defined resolved end product, but to design a system of structural and architectural components that can be that allow for carte blanche creation of new built spaces with as minimal oversight as possible, to suggest a potential collection of voids and starting points with the tools and approaches to infill it. The curious thing about Detroit is that it's its own largest landlord, with plenty of its suburban outskirts and single-family zoned areas being a mix between empty parcels and owned homes and abandoned homes in varying conditions that are in the de facto ownership of the municipal government.
It is within this context and the very real conditions of widespread poverty and unemployment in Detroit that many of the city's more desperate residents have developed their own subculture of scrapping and dismantling unclaimed homes and selling these materials in a well-established system of illicit markets. What we are proposing is to legitimize this practice, expanding its scope and educating large portions of Detroit's population in this trade while shifting Detroit's land holdings away from hoarded collection of unused properties to a system of public assets that can be beneficial to the community. To address this, we began designing a system of structural and architectural components that allow for the free creation of new built space with as minimal oversight as possible. The material and assembly logic proposed here are a system of modular components created not only from scrapped and upcycled traditional architectural materials, but also taps in to the city's wide collection of industrial remnants and abandoned materials. Here we see excerpts from a proposed manual provided by the Detroit Land Bank Authority with the purpose of educating citizens with the knowledge and skills to delaminate and expand autonomously and safely.
By treating these scrapped homes as a public commodity, we hope to encourage residents, regardless of their socioeconomic background, to take advantage of this generative material resource as a means to further encourage home expansion and ownership through a system that foregrounds labor capital over monetary capital. At the scale of a parcel, we explored a series of potential scenarios with either abandoned or occupied homes as a starting point. These yielded a set of possibilities where individuals could grow, scrap, and subdivide these parcels based on their particular situation, with some homes of Detroit's housing stock acting as a material resource and some being gifted back to qualified residents as a byproduct of their labor capital. The current site offers two situations where the homes have either been abandoned homes that are actively occupied. These drawings speculate on how these two starting points are transformed by the residents in different ways by either extracting or adding equity through subtractive or additive processes. Within this pseudo-anarchic setting, users are allowed to either combine or divide parcels, sell off portions of their homes to be delaminated, extend their residential footprints, open up any variety of commercial space, collectively manifest new community spaces, or create any other variety of urbanic conditions unable to articulate in the municipality's present grid of single-family parcels and limited legal use capabilities. At the scale of the building, we initially generated a set of massings that explored the relationship between existing residential typologies and new formal interventions, which we called characters, to show potential interventions on how these base conditions can be expanded or divided, allowing us to explore programmatic relationships and also address the project at an urban level. The site model that we've made is a gestural slice of Detroit's North End district. The model serves as a game board and allows us to further illustrate the permutations in which the site can be infilled. Our project is intended to be a non-specific matte condition that is applied to the majority of Detroit's blighted and deteriorating suburban landscape. The final stage of our project included designing a collection of high-resolution interventions that represented our intent with more detail and intricacy. To this, we introduced a series of civilian narratives inspired and centered around real residents of Detroit to show the varying approaches and possibilities that this project could yield. Consider the Ramdani family. The Ramdani family has taken it upon themselves to expand their two-story home and redesign it to have an accessory dwelling unit attached to the side that extends into the former master bedroom. This new unit acts as a secondary form of income while increasing the home's value. The family have also purchased half the adjacent parcel for future home extensions. Or consider Steve Coy, a recent college graduate working as a performance artist while working some side gigs for supplemental income. He and his fiance managed to acquire a low-cost brick duplex from the Detroit Land Bank Authority that was in need of moderate repairs. They found it most appropriate to scrap the majority of the home to get the capital needed to repair and redesign the space into a modest two-bedroom home with a large greenhouse as a passion project that further engages with the neighborhood. Or lastly, consider Tommy Stephens, a retired school teacher and current bar owner. Tommy has lived in Detroit for 40 years. Owning an already spacious Victorian home and having a good amount of initial capital, he has decided to use the new land and zoning laws to expand his home into a 5-unit motel as a new semi-active business venture, bringing new commercial activity into the neighborhood. In addition to the home extensions, a greenhouse and a motel, our other schemes included a brick duplex converted into a community boxing ring and a deteriorating 4-square home into a car dealership. Within the overall block axo, a set of potential community programs can be seen occupying the areas between homes, implying a secondary layer of community interaction that would otherwise be impossible under the current land use regulations of Detroit. And then we have a video to end it. Thank you.
I have a quick question, and I want to let the visiting critics talk, but because there's a lot to say about this project, I think it's actually pretty interesting. Can you guys talk about the, let's say, the kind of assistance, or if it's necessary for the people in the neighborhood to be able to realize these? Is it done purely bottom up, where it's self-build, or is there a kind of support infrastructure that you can imagine, not only in expertise, but in terms of other issues relative just like to code and things like that to allow these to be realized? It could be financial assistance too, by the way.
Right, so like, I guess implicit in our project would be like a rezoning of single family zones to allow these things to manifest. And then along with that, like the legitimization of like scrapper culture and an establishment of basic infrastructure for these material exchanges to happen, which I guess is pretty implied in a lot of our drawings. But it would be essentially like an opening up of these resources, as well as like, I mean, we propose like a manual that would also give them like the base knowledge on how to do this themselves, on how to like properly take down load bearing walls and expand the home footprints, and safely reuse facade materials. So there would be like a big push by like the city government or whatever kind of legal authority that would allow this to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate this project for its, let's say, it's sort of defining for itself, or you guys in particular defining for yourselves what is architectural about this degree project. And it's not a building, it's a platform, which of course has associated with it, just as Lawrence was asking about, it has an associated economy, has an associated sort of understanding of labor, let's say a certain amount of co-creation or kind of distributed authorship. And so it really begins to question, or let's say invent a kind of role for the, I'm going to say, architectural entrepreneur, which is kind of how I see this project. There's a certain entrepreneurial spirit where it's, again, less about designing a thing rather than sort of deploying a platform or a kind of systematic way of activating, augmenting, underused property, And I wonder if associated with that, I mean, because with the deployment of a platform, I think there are a whole other set of tools that would need to, I think this is possible now, just as Airbnb is possible now, Uber is possible now, only because of a certain kind of convergence of material, mobility, and technology. And I think there might be some aspects of this project that could be fleshed out a little bit more in terms of the app that would be designed to allow for the, you know, swapping of materials, sharing of materials, the networks, the kind of bottom-up networks that would need to somehow communicate with one another to potentially create hybrid ownership of some of these buildings. One of the questions I have is, unless I missed something, and that's possible, but is there any, these buildings seem to sort of respect the limits of their individual lots. And I wonder if there's ever used the phrase at some point, mat condition or mat building. And I was intrigued by that, wondering if any of these buildings ever combine across lots to create larger networks of spaces. I think you're probably limited, and I don't know if you're using steel or if this is all wood in keeping with the kind of home construction that is on the site, but like you're probably limited in terms of spans and things that you can produce, but that doesn't mean you can't create larger buildings that are made of cellular spaces and promote a certain type of, let's say, play in scale and what might be produced by a larger kind of conglomeration of interconnected spaces rather than the kind of lot-driven thing. So I'm sort of saying a few different things here because I'm really fascinated by the potential of this as a kind of distributed system and also a kind of material practice. And it's certainly in, let's say, it's very relevant vis-a-vis the sharing economy, the kind of the mesh economy. And I'm interested in the kinds of infrastructural networks that undergird this architectural network, because I think it's about time that architecture caught up with or participated in these kinds of distributed authorship or sort of distributed ways of making rather than sort of the building as an object. So really great job. I love the drawings and the videos are fantastic.
Thank you, Frank. To answer your question, as of we're at the point that the project currently stands, in the scale at which we approached engaging the community, in some cases was just limited to a community program being added to an additional, I mean, like an existing house. To shortly answer, no, we don't have any combinations yet that explore what happens when two or more houses come together to explore that.
But there is like an underlying concept where people can like purchase adjacent lots and expand their homes. Even in the final access, you see like two homes adjacent to each other that bought up the middle plot and are both like sharing it with like their own like scrapped expansions. So like there is a concept of like you don't have to just stick to your own land parcel, but you're allowed to like kind of exchange parcels of land and exchange like building rights or you know rights to have like a garden or a theater in your backyard or whatever. So there's like a concept where things can be shared and exchanged, but I guess we never made it where like actual homes are combining, but there's like a sense where there's like a sense of exchange between you know homes in different ways.
Because what Frank's talking about would produce different, if there are larger collectives or whether it's one or two family or multi-generation families, right, et cetera, it would challenge the hegemony of the single family house. You know, so the current system generally relies right upon the kind of, you know, that given plot division, right? It's just something to think about. It also might produce greater kind of social capital in terms of the ambitions of the project, right? To you know, for these things to proliferate and how they'd be executed, right? I'm not sure if it's going to be done, you know, that was part of the leading part of my question, whether it's going to be done only from, let's say, you know, the people you interview, which I thought was really interesting, but, you know, there are probably other different kinds of clients or other different kind of collaborations that might give them more social capital and economic means to realize some of these potentials, as well as sharing resources, certainly. It's interesting.
I have a question, because I'm correct me if I'm wrong. So I'm trying to figure out who's going to qualify to do these, because I mean, you are, and I might be completely wrong and I didn't get it, so that's why I'm asking you. I'm trying to understand, because right now there is, let's say, the so-called freedom of the people to appropriate buildings that are abandoned, and they can do whatever they want, and it kind of, it's a self-supporting system, while instead you're going to put boundaries around it, and correct me if I'm wrong, and they're going to have to buy houses, and you're actually setting in a system when there's a system that already, it's not legal, I understand. When there's a system that already works by itself, you are kind of imposing another system on it. So who gets to use this system? Because if you have to have the money to buy it and then to do it, then I'm saying, well, if I don't, I'm like, yeah, social capital versus real capital. Yeah, exactly. So how does that work?
Well, the concept was that if you own a home in Detroit, I mean, everyone can participate in the system if you own a home, or if you're homeless, or if you're housing insecure, where like if you own a home, you can expand your home using your own savings, or you know, participate in like this system. But like if you're housing insecure, then you can, you know, go to Detroit Land Bank Authority and ask them if you can occupy one of the more occupiable abandoned homes. And then the most, like, the worst one, the ones in the worst conditions would just be used for like a mature resource for the rest of the homes. But like there's no strict like who qualifies and who doesn't. But I guess the general idea is just people who don't own a home, or are housing insecure, or have some kind of socioeconomic barrier could just ask the Detroit Land Bank Authority for an occupiable abandoned home, or one that's close to occupiable, and then instead of the Detroit Land Bank Authority just hoarding it like they do with the tens and thousands of homes they have now, they would just, you know, allow them to legally occupy it, and then, you know, have the rights to that house.
Because currently, again, correct me if I'm wrong, the Detroit Land Bank Authority currently chokes the supply of parcels that they make available for purchase, right, because of the already existing low prices of the parcels themselves.
Right.
I actually would like to pick on that, and I'm sure, you know, for both of you, you don't want to hear more of what I have to say, because we had this discussion before, perhaps twice, not only once. I was actually happy first to see that you changed the title to "We Did It Our Way" instead of, so that's amazing. And, you know, I mean, as also, you know, I mean, many critics brought that out, you know, the point about collectivity and the attempt to see a more collective effort, and not just to look at the problem in terms of singular plots. I totally agree with that. You know, and maybe perhaps I have nothing more to add, but I was also thinking, maybe looking at your project maybe with a fresh eye today, that maybe other aspect that I didn't see before. There is a certain, and hopefully that will tie back to our discussion, there is a certain sense of, I'm not saying homogeneity or equality, even when you answer to the question why you are restricted by singular plots. And your answer was, okay, you know, there are exchanges, there are collective efforts that will take place between one plot and another. And the impression that one gets is that as if all these plots are equal in terms of, and you represent them in this way. It seems to me that the street that you picked, the plots that you picked, it could be any other plot. So there is this sense that maybe, if you, let me put it in a different way. I'm curious to know about the real estate value, let's say. Yes, there is a general condition of urban shrinkage, let's say population shrinkage, abandonment of many houses, and you are trying to, again, revive these communities. But the way at least your project is presented, or the way I see it through the drawings and the models, and as wonderful as they are, I mean, like, don't get me wrong, these are really intriguing work here. I get a sense that something is a bit abstract, not in terms of the architecture details, and I commend you on the attention that you pay to all these, but in the sense there is as if the background or the context is somehow is not there. And when I say that, I'm looking for more. Maybe this is a point that we discussed before. I want to see the general condition larger than your particular focus. What's happening at the larger scale of the city? Where are the points that there is a deteriorating maybe real estate value? Maybe what are the points that maybe have some potentiality for generating social capital? Things like that I'm not getting, and maybe you have that in your research, but I'm not seeing it clearly in your project. So I mean, I still have the question, because you are still limiting your proposal or your project to ownership. What would be other models that are not based on ownership, where the housing is a right and not a commodity? So that question, I think you can address or you can raise if you bring into the discussion some differentiation between one plot and another, and one particular location and another, to bring it back to the ground. And I think that to do that, maybe one of the elements that you can mobilize is to look into the real estate values and how it's deteriorating from one plot to another, or differentiated from one to another. Thank you.
Okay, maybe to build on these great comments, and also to, again, congratulations on the project. I think it's great. I think that the videos are beautiful, and the drawings are very well done. And what I really appreciate about this project is that, I could imagine you guys going to the Detroit Land Bank Authority and proposing this. And I think that it's really great that you're proposing an intervention into an existing platform or service, and recognizing the work that's happening in Detroit right now by those kinds of institutions, and seeing how you could really intervene within that work that's happening on the ground. So I wanted to commend you for that. And I think, as some of the other critics have pointed out, it kind of brings up, your proposal brings up many things, but it kind of brings up, so what is the extent of this intervention? If you're, I think it's really nice that you're kind of inverting a hierarchy where like materials become kind of almost more foregrounded than design itself, but then it also invites all these questions about, infrastructure and zoning, and forms of ownership or collective ownership and land use. And I think these questions of like real estate are also important. What happens once these properties are improved? Is it only intended for inhabitation? Would the people who worked on them be able to, then sell the house, or does Detroit Land Bank Authority retain that? So that would be kind of my question is, to think about how does this kind of toolkit start to expand, to give guides for, how to, I'm just thinking about like in trying to shrink these neighborhoods, like Detroit trying to shut down the grid in certain areas. So like, how would you get electricity if your power has been shut off? I think there's examples of, of how to like tap into the grid, like how communities tap into like the electric grid in their own ways, that, things like that, to kind of build the infrastructural element, or, I think for like zoning, here's how you go about, I don't know, writing to your like community board or something. Like an urban planner would have more specific kind of input than me on that, but like that kind of idea. And I can also see here how, like the real contribution that architecture can have, right? Or it's sort of giving some templates that people can work with, who don't have a design background. So I think that's really great. And then also maybe thinking about, well, what are some of the labor strategies that we could also propose, for helping to actually do some construction work, or things like that. And I guess one other comment I had was to maybe sort of resist the app sharing economy trend a little bit, because I think what's really nice about this is like it could work well within other, like, you know, just modes of sharing in a community through an existing, you know, actual social network, or like, you know, something even like Craigslist, something a bit more simple that might, you know, I think it's easy to get subsumed into the capitalist logics of the sharing economy. And I think your project offers a nice resistance to that.
Can I throw you guys a question? Again, congratulations. It's been really, you know, a great ride to work with you all year. So I am really excited to see that the conversation is bringing up all of these great points. One of the things that in a way has submerged in your project, and I wonder if you guys want to address it here. It actually follows a little bit on the heels of this app sharing thing, or maybe just social media. Right? Social media produces not just sharing, but it produces an entire, like, for want of a better term, stylistic tendencies, new attitudes, avatar things. It produces its own sort of capital space. Things are capitalized. So people buy and sell avatars in video games now, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that you guys talked about early in the project was that you wanted this to have a kind of, and again, I think this term is going to be maybe misinterpreted, so I'm hesitating to use it, but, you know, for want of a better term, an aesthetic potentiality. That one of the ways it's going to create social and cultural capital is because everybody is going to be able to kind of design something within obviously a certain set of limits of their own. And the bricolage concept was also a kind of, you know, a hybrid aesthetics kind of thing. The scrapper culture thing was also a look, if you will. And in a way that that kind of receded as the project evolved, but it's kind of in there in Nuce a little bit. And I wonder, just in this conversation, whether you think that plays a role, because I think in sharing economies, it definitely plays a role. There is no question, right, that the image people put up, the way influencers represent themselves and all of that. And so I'm not asking about whether this is going to beautify Detroit, so please don't misunderstand what I'm asking. I'm asking, what is the social role here of the kind of aesthetics that this is going to produce? And have you guys thought a little bit about that?
I mean, we haven't thought directly what like the social impact of what the aesthetics of the project would be, but like we have considered how if we're kind of encouraging this reuse of like scrap entire chunks of buildings, like windows and signage and certain things that can be taken off completely, mixed with like these more kind of blanket conditions of reusing facade materials in these kind of more grid-like fashions, like it would create a certain aesthetic. And although like it would be easier for some people just to build, you know, simple box expansions, like we do give them the tools to do something more creative. And like in a more, I guess, optimistic sense, like there's an assumption that like even though some people would make really mundane things, a lot of people would make kind of with all of this like freedom that they have in like building codes and zoning capabilities, like they would make fun and fantastical and interesting stuff. And like maybe people from different parts of Detroit, different parts of Michigan, or, you know, regionally would become interested, or it would become like, I wouldn't ever want to say that it would become like trendy or anything, but it would be a fascinating thing to see how people with like minimal kind of design background would kind of use these tools in ways that we wouldn't even be able to like fully predict or manifest. But like and the thing about like, I mean, there is a sense of like beautification doesn't create value, but there's a sense where like a safe, complete kind of interesting spaces do create their own sense of value. And since to kind of go back to an earlier point, like the people who get these scrapped homes and repair them and make them occupiable do get the rights to eventually sell them, because the whole point of this was like people create this stuff to make their own equity, since it's so hard to purchase homes, especially right now in the US, and it's so hard to get into the housing market, that we want them to have a pathway into property ownership and, you know, a financial asset that doesn't require such an upfront payment that most people can't afford. So like, since there's like an issue where like people get to own these homes and eventually sell them, like there would be an incentive to make it nice enough to resell and make it occupying enough to resell while also.
What I would suggest, which I didn't really think about until today, amazingly enough, this did not occur to me, is that actually, and this maybe is a distinction between us and the designer community, whatever, you know, intellectuals, and the true populism of your project, because I actually think that on some level, one of the things that could be a major driver for your project and its ground upness is precisely that people want to do crazy stuff. They want to like post cat videos on YouTube, and they want to post pictures of themselves doing stupid things. And I say that, you know, not because I want to say that they're stupid, but because that is a fundamental driver in the kind of ground up thing, right? And so I think in a way you're under recognizing. Again, I'm only really thinking this now, so I'm kind of setting this out as a possibility. I'm only now recognizing that actually could be a major driver and potentially even a more forceful and more, let's say, successful generator of cultural capital than, you know, what we like to think of as good, solid, serious urbanism, however creative we're being with the ground upness of it. I just want to put that out there as an idea.
I think, Saul, there has to be a discussion too about this. This is interesting. You know, there's been a lot of, I mean, I want to get Debbie to get in here soon because I know she's got some interesting ideas on this too. But as you know, there's been different attempts to deal with kinds of scale of intervention, right? Like Haybraken talked about the frame, right? That would produce a kind of infrastructure that would be, you know, meet codes and other certain requirements, and then there'd be bottom up within that frame to guarantee, you know, life safety and other issues like that. But it also allowed for larger infrastructural implementation, right? I don't think we should be going to that either, clearly. But I think, Caitlin, you brought up some things, and I think it's important that, guys, I think it's really interesting what you're doing. But at the same time, I think there's other kinds of, we talked about lot to lot, other forms of collectives, but at the same time, when you show the whole block, it really begs the question of other kinds of, you know, ways of building in community programs too, and also community literally infrastructure, and also kind of facilities and services into the urban plan that would challenge the kind of pre-existing, again, organization of the, you know, the kind of, you know, soldiers of single family houses. So like not only the backyard, the street, all these kind of things, but there could be all sorts of ways of kind of, you know, creating other shared amenities that are outside the domestic that would really help implement this. In that regard, it would also, and that includes energy, right? Energy sharing, energy production. That would also bring a different scale and also a way to kind of grow it incrementally, because you have to understand what would be necessitated for this community to be sustained. The other thing I don't mean sustainable, talking about like green architecture per se. I'm talking about sustainability in terms of its livelihood moving into the future. The other thing I just wanted to say, and then I'm going to shut up, is that, Caitlin, this idea, and I know other people have brought it up too, about this is just something I'm really interested in, by the way, sorry. From my research, has been looking at this. This idea of the labor system, you know, they're even doing this in LA now with the accessory dwelling units. There, certain architects are using labor force that are formerly incarcerated men and women, and they're part of the ideas that they have to be trained in order to, and they have to hire a certain percentage of this group to be able to move them into the job force. So there's an interesting idea that they're actually trying to work with people who live locally to actually kind of build these things and give them the expertise to be able to do it. So I think it's interesting, instead of it's a kind of counter gentrification strategy in terms of training a labor force that could be sustainable, which I think is really interesting too within this. So it might, if you look at, even though Mockbee's work with rural studios has been criticized for being rarefied, there was some of that kind of thinking within some of the formative processes of rural studio.
I have another actually something else to add, which bring the discussion back to the real estate. And I mean, not just to insist on this point at all. It's just to maybe I'm saying the same thing but differently. Is that there is a sense of equality, let's say, and maybe that will take us to the point that Caitlin raised about somewhat, romanticizing this kind of shared economy. Because there is the assumption that all the participants here in this street or this community are equal. Mm-hmm. And I think that might be slightly overlooking the actual material condition which these residents exist in. And that's why I raised the point of real estate or differentiating between one plot versus the other. Because it's not just about sharing the outcome or sharing in terms of consumption, but it's also about sharing the labor and sharing the production. So I mean, like if an individual or an individual family is constructing their own space for a single family, I think your idea is that, okay, that can be exchanged, or maybe the learning process can be exchanged. But the question, let's say, like maybe a community is trying to build one, project in this plot, and then they move to another plot and so forth. Then what kind of the dynamics is taking place? They don't all come from the same gender, from the same class, from the same race. And I think that's an important question that perhaps you should raise, or I mean, not to answer is not that you have to answer it, but somehow you need to articulate it somewhere in the project. So you avoid this romanticization of what a community is, as if it's a homogeneous, equal thing. That's all. Thank you.
One thing that I can't help but think of when I hear these comments, which are, I think these are really fantastic challenges and extensions or additions to the original presentation, is how to extend this logic and think of its repercussions. And one of the tools that might help you do that is the different, so there's these two forms of, let's say, design that Keller Easterling talks about. One being object form and the second being active form. And so this idea that in active form, you're not only designing the thing, you're designing a set of, let's say, interdependencies between things. And in this case, interdependencies between elements in this kind of urban environment. And Lawrence brought up issues about energy, about community infrastructure, other types of spaces, but also perhaps other types, not only of architectural spaces, but maybe open space itself, or the absence of building. And when you go, if you don't mind going to that slide with the kind of plan view that has sort of the black fill for the buildings and the white space for the empty lots. I mean, is there this form of thinking in the guise of active form? We are designing that set of interdependencies that is not only the parts of the house, this one, yes, thank you. This looks just like a game board to me, right? And so not just thinking about buildings in sort of, let's say, space as a kind of neutral container, but space itself as one of the pieces in the game. And so maybe every time you build a building or you build an addition to a building, you're also buying a stake in open space or buying a share in the kind of energy market. And you're to Caitlin's point about kind of, the capitalist sort of like, I think what you're not intending is for someone to make this great house and then, basically flip it and sell it and leave, but to somehow through this idea of active form, kind of embedding a series of interdependent relationships with the community kind of structure overall, and reaching beyond the kind of limits of your physical house itself, right? And so you're participating in this network of interdependencies in a way that is in addition to the kind of architectural form. And this reminds me of like an Othello game board, right? Where there's white space and black space, and you're designing both, right? And thinking about the sort of flip side of the object form, and creating again, I go back to this idea of the creation of a platform for those exchanges to take place. And so maybe, you're designing a garden you purchased the house or the part of the house, but you're also purchasing a garden space that you then are the steward of, and somehow cultivating for public use, right? And so there's this sort of interplay between solid and void, and different types of, you're designing the system in addition to the kind of kit of parts itself, the physical kit of parts.
Right. I mean, maybe this was overlooked in our presentation, but one of our schemes that we designed with the greenhouse is essentially intending to do just that. There's not only the existing architecture that's been transformed, but and even in the video, you will see that behind the greenhouse is a sort of community garden space, or it's better seen in the axo. And it's not just in one part of the site, but also in another. Like if you see behind the auto show space. So essentially, we're thinking that there, like, one program that we design can like extend beyond just like the existing like building, because I mean, so that's just to point out one of the.
No, and I totally picked up on that. And I think extending that, and by looking at that overall plan, you can imagine that those things aren't necessarily always co-located, because the problem that you started off with here is the kind of management of density, or its flip side, the kind of management of emptiness, and how to design that emptiness in a way that is not leftover space, but is open space or valuable kind of void space. And so that you're potentially designing a building building a building over here, but you're the steward of open space over here in a strategic kind of shaping of that, let's say, lack of density that could then potentially be filled in over time, but is always in its incompleteness is always somehow it's working in a way, or it's an intentional incompleteness that is designed, as opposed to just waiting to be filled in when things thrive again. So the cultivation of emptiness at the same time as the orchestration of physical parts and pieces, I think, is an interesting way into this idea of active form, and also this idea of maybe it's a form of urbanism within this kind of shared economy model.
Actually, I think that's a really interesting idea, Frank, given the situation in Detroit, where they're just drowning in land. And I'm wondering if and I don't know, the plans for Detroit now are all about nodes, right? About trying to concentrate population and leave large tracts of land for potential agricultural or just environmental wilding within the city. I mean, but truly trying to manage what's empty, and that allows for creating density. So I think that's a really interesting idea, this notion of stewardship, which is a big responsibility, and would then come with some kind of payoff. I mean, maybe this is a mini displacement story where, because this notion of concentrating density also means potentially moving people around, right? Out of where, if they're the only people left in a decimated area. That's an interesting idea. And so trying to think of, though, what gets shared, or what are the shared infrastructures then, if it's not a community garden in your backyard. The only thing I might offer up is, I know there's a big water tax issue in Detroit, that a lot of the people lost their houses. A lot of these neighborhoods were decimated when people couldn't pay the water tax on their houses. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of collective financial infrastructures that support what Ashraf was talking about, the differences that will adhere in a neighborhood that seems all the same, but probably still has a big economic and social differences. Things like that. There might be other financial mechanisms as too. So, I mean, it's truly a sharing economy and that it's financial, right? That it supports the mortgage, debt, tax, fee structure of the houses.
Yeah, you guys should look into this project that Keller
Yeah.
developed. It was really about just sort of thinking through her project, and I, if I'm correct, I think she designed an interface, a kind of user interface for this system in a way that your plan reminded me of. So yeah, I think there's some really interesting thinking being done about this type of, let's say.
What was that published in, Frank? That wasn't the thing she did a long time ago, was it? The one
I feel it was a long time ago, and that's why I'm struggling to remember where.
The interactive one that she did for it was the ones on the American House, whatever that was.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
I haven't looked at that in years.
I'll try to dig it up while we're talking, and I'll put something in the chat.
Okay, thanks.
Mentioning Keller Easterling also makes me think back to the top. I forget who mentioned infrastructure as an issue earlier, and the question of statecraft, or what she calls extra statecraft, and the public-private opposition and problems at stake there. I'm wondering, in addition to the building of the houses, if it's possible to say more about, water politics, like Deborah mentioned, plumbing problems, accessibility issues, food deserts, infrastructure, social infrastructure in relation to social capital, maybe, and shared public infrastructure, maybe especially in contrast to private technoscapes like Airbnb.
Yeah, I mean, it's just Detroit is so hard in that. I mean, I think you're right, and I think Frank was talking about that too. What he's raising is the fact that when you have a very dense city and amenities or infrastructures are scarce, creating that community around sharing them is kind of a no-brainer. And in Detroit, it's a little bit harder. And what they really need is the density, the old urban infill, get rid of the missing teeth. Let's create street life. Kinds of, they sound a little retardataire, but they were very important in the rebuilding of cities that were decimated, Rust Belt cities at a smaller scale. It's this question, it's weird, of urban infill in ways that we don't talk about so much, but really should. I mean, it could be come down to the sidewalk.
I was just thinking,
yeah,
I like the image that we're looking at right now.
Yeah.
With people walking in the street, a whole new urban infrastructure needs to be imagined and developed, maybe from the ground up rather than top down, right? And at a pedestrian scale, because of course Detroit is the old motor city, the Motown,
Right.
The car infrastructure, the roadway infrastructure
Right.
city that, and that, that's not there anymore. And, Michael Moore's worked on that a lot, and,
Right.
many, for decades. So yeah, to focus on these people walking, actually, it's great. They're walking in the middle of the street.
In the middle of the
It
street.
means a lot. There's no cars there. It's the people. It's an open street, right? Like we have now during COVID times. So that there's a great opportunity there for thinking about like Jane Jacobs on sidewalks and the life and death of American cities, and Detroit maybe kind of dying out in a certain way, but then coming back to life according to a whole new urban model that can be a shared ground up, labor, a different kind of labor, a different kind of community, and including more diverse community, but not white dominated, gentrification. So there's that. Now that I see this image based on what we're just talking about, it comes to life in a whole new way with these people just walking right down the middle of a road, right?
And a car parked in the backyard on the right. And that's a big Detroit typology with in these neighborhoods with these they're almost like Muse, right? With the garages on the back streets, on the backyards. So that's a kind of double density too, where you get something at the front of the lot and something at the back of the lot. Yeah, so I think they're on the right track. This really is about making, in a very dense city, it's about finding nature within the urban density. Here, it's about creating the density and co-opting dragging the empty vacancy into the conversation through other means.
I think one interesting thing at the you both kind of arrived to at the end of the project is some of the sort of new, I guess I could call them typologies, where you start to interject layers of program into these lots that would have never been there before.
Yeah.
To me, that was an exciting point to sort of arrive at, and potentially could, I think, exploring that further could hit a lot of points that the critics have raised, in terms of like thinking about who this is for, how it's reorganizing, even just the block itself. You're not really replicating, the house on a single family home on a lot any longer. But I think the questions about, is home ownership the only kind of mechanism through which all of this works was a really important one. And are there different modes by which, these lots are reappropriated and serve the needs, and what exactly are those, and so on.
Right, because I feel like even at the midterm, we were trying to explore like non-residential uses of formerly residential space, and I feel like back then we were like a little bit shy when we were only thinking about like people opening up like bodegas or car dealerships or repair shops kind of out of a residential typology. But toward the end of it, yeah, we were thinking more broadly, and like even if they don't have the money to do that, like what are just some different ways you could just use an empty parcel, which is how we kind of got to like the theaters in the backyard garden and the food truck in the back, where it's like it's less about building a space and just like kind of rethinking how you can cheaply kind of retool the space in some way that's productive and kind of oriented to reach out further than just your parcel. But yeah, it was a nice place to kind of end on, or just to slowly develop towards the end. But
I think that's kind of one of the tensions too in the project, is trying to imagine something that, and how to represent something that you're essentially saying everyone else will make for themselves.
Right.
Which maybe goes without saying, but I think that's kind of an interesting tension in the project that you've had to contend with. the whole semester, really.
Great. Nice work, Gus.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
A good one to end a good day, and I want to congratulate you. It's got some legs. Keep working. You got to keep working on it, though.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lawrence.
Great job. And by the way, those are nice models, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice models.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it was really a pleasure working with both of you, Abby and Aaron. Thank you so much, and terrific work. I really enjoyed this year.
Congratulations, guys. Really, it's been really a great trip.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just like to commend you on how serious and how focused and dedicated you both were the whole semester, and it was really a pleasure to see that.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you all. It was a
Yeah,
pleasure.
congratulations to everyone. It was a great afternoon, and there were, in fact, the themes, we didn't really have a larger overarching conversation, but a lot of the issues are continuous. Another challenged community with the potential for agriculture and displacement in a different context, with a community that we haven't directly, don't know quite enough about. So it seems to be the problem that faces us all at this moment and into the floating arc future. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Great projects.
Yeah. And thanks to the critics. It's so good.
Yeah.
Wonderful, substantive, stuff to take the students forward for another couple of years.
Good, tough questions that were
Yeah.
great. You guys really
Yeah.
did a great job today in this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to
Thank
see
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Great studios and great work. Thank you.
Thanks, Ash.
Congratulations.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks, Mateo.
Yeah, great
Thank
work,
you.
everyone.
Thank Ashraf.
Thanks, all.
Have a great weekend.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Take
Bye.
care. Thank you.